The day Micah Hale rode into the town of Harrow Creek, New Mexico Territory in the spring of 1882, he was not looking for trouble, and he was certainly not looking for love, but the moment he saw Helen Whitaker standing in the middle of the main street with a rifle in her hands and fire in her gray eyes, he understood that he had found both, whether he wanted them or not. She was not shooting at anything. Not yet. She was holding the rifle across her chest like a woman who had made up her mind about something and was daring the world to argue with her. She was wearing a plain cotton dress the color of dust, and her dark brown hair had come loose from its pins and was blowing sideways in the dry New Mexico wind. She was not beautiful in the way that paintings were beautiful. She was beautiful in the way that a storm was beautiful, something you could not look away from, even when you knew it had the power to undo you. Micah pulled his horse, a steady gray gelding named Cutter, to a stop at the edge of the street and watched her for a moment before he realized what was happening. 3 men on horseback were positioned in a loose half-circle around her, their horses shuffling in the dirt. The men wore the look of men who were used to getting what they wanted: expensive saddles, clean boots, the kind of patience that came from knowing you had numbers on your side. The man in the center was heavy-shouldered and wore a black hat pushed back on his head. He had the sort of broad, sun-reddened face that looked like it had never once questioned itself. He was speaking to Helen in a low, even voice, the kind of voice that was meant to sound reasonable while delivering something that was not reasonable at all. "Mrs. Whitaker," the man was saying, "I'm going to ask you one more time to step off this parcel and let us proceed. Mr. Anson has been more than fair." "Mr. Anson has not been fair a single day in his life," Helen said. Her voice was clear and steady, and it carried the length of the street. "This land belongs to me. It belonged to my husband before me, and it is mine now, and not one of you is setting foot past this fence line." Micah looked down the side street and saw the fence line in question, a simple split-rail fence that ran along the edge of a wide, dusty property. Behind the fence was a modest house, a barn in need of paint, a water trough, and maybe 30 acres of scrubby New Mexico high desert that didn't look like much, but was clearly worth a great deal to someone. The man in the black hat, the one who seemed to be in charge of the 3 riders, shifted in his saddle and let out the kind of sigh that men let out when they have already decided how something is going to end. "Ma'am, Mr. Anson holds the deed of sale from the Territorial Land Office, signed and recorded. Now, we don't want any trouble." "Then ride back the way you came," Helen said. One of the other riders moved his horse a half-step forward, and Helen raised the rifle. It was a fluid, practiced motion, nothing theatrical about it, just the direct movement of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. The rider stopped. Micah made a decision. It was not the kind of decision a man who was merely passing through would make, and some quiet, sensible part of him recognized this even as he was making it. He nudged Cutter forward and walked the horse calmly into the gap between Helen and the 3 riders, positioning himself so that he was facing the men and Helen was at his back. "Afternoon," he said pleasantly, as though he had arrived at a social gathering. The man in the black hat looked him over with the practiced, dismissive assessment of a man who sorted people into categories quickly. He saw a tall man, lean in the way that hard living made men lean, wearing a dusty brown coat and a battered hat, with a pistol on his hip that was worn in a way that suggested it had been used before and would be used again without a great deal of fuss. He must have calculated something in Micah's favor because his tone shifted slightly. "This is private business, friend. I'd suggest you move along." "I appreciate that," Micah said. "But I'm going to need you to explain to me how land that belongs to this woman here got itself recorded as belonging to your Mr. Anson. That is none of your concern. It's becoming my concern." There was a pause that stretched like wire being pulled taut. Then the man in the black hat looked between Micah and Helen, made another calculation, and apparently decided that this particular morning was not the morning. He settled his hat and gathered his reins. "We'll be back, Mrs. Whitaker," he said, "with a marshal and a proper order, and then there won't be anything for rifles to argue about." He turned his horse and rode away, and the other two followed without a word. Micah watched them go until they had turned a corner and disappeared, and then he turned Cutter around to face Helen. She was still holding the rifle, but she had lowered it. She was looking at him with those clear gray eyes, and they were not grateful eyes, they were measuring eyes, the eyes of a woman who was deciding exactly what she was dealing with. "I did not ask for your help," she said. "No," Micah agreed. "You didn't. I had the situation managed." "You had 3 armed men managed," he said, "alone with 1 rifle. 1 rifle is generally sufficient." He almost smiled. He stopped himself. "My name is Micah Hale. I'm a land surveyor out of Santa Fe. I was coming to Harrow Creek to take a job, but I haven't arrived at the job yet." He paused. "Who is Anson?" She studied him for another moment. Then, apparently deciding something, she lowered the rifle all the way and rested the stock against the ground. "Come inside," she said. "I'll tell you about Warren Anson. It will take a few minutes, and you look like a man who could use coffee." He dismounted and tied Cutter to the fence post, and he followed Helen Whitaker through the gate and toward her house, and it was the most consequential walk of his life, though he didn't know that yet. Inside, the house was small and carefully kept. There was a cast-iron stove, a table with 4 chairs, a braided rug on the floor, and a shelf of books that surprised him, not because he thought she was incapable of reading, but because the collection was serious and varied. He spotted a legal text, 2 surveying manuals, a geography, and 3 novels. She poured coffee from a blue enamel pot and set a cup in front of him without ceremony and sat across the table with her own. The rifle she leaned against the wall within easy reach. He noted that too. "Warren Anson," she said, wrapping her hands around her cup, "is the largest landowner in this county and the neighboring one. He has been buying up homestead claims for 3 years, ever since the railroad announced it would lay track through this valley. The land along this stretch of the territory is going to be worth a significant amount of money once the railroad comes through, and Anson has been acquiring it by any means he finds convenient." "Means like forged deeds," Micah said. "Means like forged deeds," she confirmed. "My husband, Robert, filed this claim in 1876. Robert died of fever 18 months ago. I have the original land patent, witnessed and filed. But 2 months ago, the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe began showing a deed of sale that supposedly transfers this property to Anson's holding company, dated before Robert died. And you didn't sell." "I did not sell. Robert did not sell. The signature on that deed of sale is a forgery. I have written to the Territorial Governor's office twice. I have written to the Federal Land Commissioner once. I have received no useful response." She said it without self-pity, just plainly, like a woman reading out the items on a supply list. "The man you just spoke with is Boyd Cal. He works for Anson as a kind of field representative. He has visited me 4 times in the last 2 months. Each visit has been slightly less polite than the one before." Micah turned his coffee cup in his hands. "You said you have the original land patent." "I have a copy of it. The original is filed in Santa Fe." She paused. "Or it was. The land office clerk told me last month that the original cannot be located." "Convenient," Micah said. "Extremely." He looked at her over the rim of his cup. In the thin morning light coming through the kitchen window, he could see the tiredness around her eyes, the specific kind of tired that came not from lack of sleep, but from too many mornings spent fighting the same battle. She was not old. He guessed she was somewhere in her late 20s. But she carried something heavier than her years. "What job did you come here to do?" she asked. "Boundary survey for the Harrow Creek Town Commission. They're preparing for the railroad, updating their plats." Her eyes sharpened. "You know surveying law. It's what I do." "Do you know land patent law, federal homestead law?" "Well enough." He set down the cup. "Mrs. Whitaker, I'll be honest with you. I have a job to do here and it starts tomorrow. But if what you're telling me is true, and I have no reason to doubt you, then what Anson is doing is federal fraud on top of theft. And I have some experience with how the land office works in Santa Fe because I've worked with them on disputed boundaries before." She looked at him for a long time. Those gray eyes were not soft, but they were not hostile either. They were the eyes of a woman who had learned to look at things clearly because she could not afford not to. "Mr. Hale," she said carefully, "I appreciate what you did this morning, but I want to be direct with you. I am not a woman who needs a man to solve her problems. I have been running this property alone for 18 months. I have kept the cattle, what's left of them, through a dry summer and a hard winter. I have maintained the fence lines and repaired the barn roof and managed the accounts. I'm not looking for someone to ride in and take over." "I'm not offering to take over," he said. "I'm offering to help. There's a difference." She considered this. "What do you want in return?" "Nothing," he said simply. She looked skeptical. He could see her working through it, trying to find the angle because in her experience and from what she'd told him, it was a hard experience. Everyone wanted something. "I am a stranger," he said, "who happened to ride in at a bad moment. I don't have any claim on you or your land or your gratitude. But I know the law and I know how the land office works, and I can see that someone is trying to steal from you. That bothers me." He stood up. "I'll start my job tomorrow. I'll be in town for at least 3 weeks. If you want to talk about the land records, come find me. If you don't, that's fine too." He put on his hat. She walked him to the door and he was almost through it when she said his name. "Mr. Hale." He turned. "Thank you," she said, "for this morning." "Yes, ma'am," he said, and went back to his horse. He spent the rest of that first day settling in at Harrow Creek's one boarding house, a 3-room affair run by a wide, cheerful woman named Mrs. Clara Beaumont, who served enormous dinners and asked a great many questions that Micah answered as briefly as possible. He began his work the next morning, walking the boundary lines of the town with his survey chain and his compass and his field notebook, working steadily through the warm spring day. By the afternoon of the second day, Helen Whitaker arrived at the edge of the property he was surveying. She was on a brown horse and carrying a saddlebag, and she looked like she had been thinking about something hard all morning. She dismounted and walked over to him without preamble. "I have the copy of my land patent," she said, pulling a folded document from the saddlebag. "And I have letters from the land office going back 2 years. I also have a name, a clerk in Santa Fe named Thomas Greer, who I believe is the one who falsified the records. He accepted a deed transfer from Anson's company on the same day. He filed a duplicate patent number that cannot be located." Micah looked at the documents. He spread them on the flat top of a fence post and studied them carefully. He had a good eye for land records. He had spent 7 years working surveys across New Mexico and Arizona territory, and he knew what authentic federal land patents looked like, knew the forms and the signature blocks and the recording numbers. "This is legitimate," he said of her patent copy. "The recording number, the land description, the witness signatures, this is a real patent." "I know it is," she said. "Proving it is real against a forgery that someone in the land office is defending is another matter." He looked up at her. She was standing with her arms crossed, not in a defensive way, but in the way of someone who was holding themselves together through the sheer force of will and organization. The wind was doing the same thing to her hair that it had done the first morning, pulling it loose and pushing it sideways, and she didn't seem to notice or care. "There's a federal land commissioner's field inspector named Albert Dowd," Micah said. "He comes through Santa Fe twice a year. I worked with him on a disputed survey in Bernalillo County in 1880. He's honest." He folded the documents carefully and handed them back to her. "If we can get a packet of this evidence to him before Anson forces a legal order, we have a chance." "How do we get it to him?" "I'll ride to Santa Fe myself at the end of the week. I can file a formal survey dispute that ties up any land transfer legally while it's under review. That buys time. Then I send word to Dowd." She studied him. "You would ride to Santa Fe on my behalf." "I'd ride to Santa Fe because that is where the records need to go," he said, "and because I am a land surveyor and falsified surveys are my professional concern." Something shifted slightly in her expression, something that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to it. "You are very good at making things sound less generous than they are." "I'm practical," he said. "No," she said. "You are kind and you are trying to hide it." He was surprised enough by that observation that he couldn't think of an immediate response, and she turned back to her horse before he could find one. But there was something in the set of her shoulders as she rode away that was different from the first morning, a fraction lighter, perhaps, or a fraction less alone. Over the next several days, they fell into a pattern that neither of them had planned. Micah worked his survey during the day, and in the evenings he went over the land records at the table in Helen's kitchen, drinking the strong coffee she made and working through the documents by lamplight. She sat across from him and contributed sharp, organized analysis. She had a mind that moved quickly and precisely, and she had already done considerable legal research on her own that Micah found genuinely useful. On the third evening, he made a comment about the surveying manuals on her shelf, and she told him that Robert had been a surveyor before his fever, which explained the books. She had learned from him, she said, enough to understand what she was reading. Then she told him about Robert quietly, without melodrama, the way she told most things. She had married him at 21, come with him to New Mexico from Missouri, helped him build the house and plant the kitchen garden and establish the small cattle operation. He had been a good man. She missed him. She said it all simply, and Micah listened without filling the silences with unnecessary words, which was something she noticed and appreciated. She told him later. On the fourth evening, she asked him about himself. He told her he was 31, from Colorado originally, that he had come to the Southwest after the war. No, not that war. The trouble had been a land dispute in Colorado that had left a man dead and Micah without the only home he had ever known, and that he had made himself a new life in the territory because the territory was a place where a man could do that if he was willing to work. "You lost land too," she said. "My father's land," he said. To a man who was willing to use the law however it suited him. She understood then why a stranger had ridden into the street on her behalf, not out of simple heroism but out of something more personal, the recognition of a wrong that he had seen before in his own life, wearing a different face. "I'm sorry," she said. "It was a long time ago," he said, but he said it in a way that acknowledged it still mattered, and she respected him for not pretending otherwise. He rode to Santa Fe at the end of that first week. The round trip took 4 days, and he filed the survey dispute and sent word to Albert Dowd, and he also spent an afternoon at the Territorial Land Office asking careful, professional questions about filing procedures that, in the asking, made it very clear to Thomas Greer that someone who knew land law was paying close attention to the Whitaker file. He did not threaten. He did not accuse. He simply asked questions. He could tell it rattled the man. When he rode back into Harrow Creek on a Tuesday evening with a fine spring sunset going orange and pink over the Jemez Mountains to the west, he found Helen at the fence of her property with a bucket of water for her horses, and she looked up when she heard Cutter's hooves on the dry road, and something happened in her face that she quickly arranged back into composure. But he had seen it, the quick light of relief, and perhaps something warmer. "How did it go?" she asked. He dismounted and told her everything, standing at the fence in the fading evening light, and she listened carefully and asked good questions, and when he had finished she said, "That was more than I expected." "It's a start," he said. "Dowd won't come for another 6 weeks at least. Until then the legal filing gives you some protection, but Anson may still try to pressure you." She nodded. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the mountains, and then she said without looking at him, "Will you stay for the 6 weeks?" He looked at her profile. She was trying to make the question sound purely practical. She was not entirely succeeding. "I have a job here for 3 more weeks," he said carefully. "After that I have some flexibility." She looked at him then. Those gray eyes were direct as always, but there was something in them now that had not been there the first morning, a kind of careful, cautious hope. The look of a woman who had been alone long enough that she had stopped expecting things to change and was now confronted with the unsettling possibility that they might. "Then stay," she said. "There is a room in the barn that Robert used as an office. It is clean and dry. Mrs. Beaumont's cooking is excellent, but it is not free." He almost smiled. He did not stop himself this time. "I'll think about it," he said. He moved into the barn office the following Monday. It was not a grand arrangement. The room was small, barely 10 feet across, with a narrow cot, a wood-burning stove, a wash basin, and a writing desk that had been Robert Whitaker's. There were still pencil marks on the desk from Robert's survey work, columns of figures and compass bearings. Micah sat at that desk on his first evening and looked at the marks for a while and felt the weight of what he was doing, stepping into a space that a good man had left behind, trying to be useful to the woman that good man had loved. He worked his survey during the day, came back in the evenings, and ate dinner with Helen at the kitchen table. She was a good cook, efficient and without fuss, and the meals were nourishing in the way that food prepared with real attention always is. They talked through dinner, about the land records at first, but gradually about other things. About books, because she read voraciously and had opinions about everything she read. About the territory, which Micah knew well from years of travel and which Helen had come to love despite, or perhaps because of, its harshness. About Missouri, where she had grown up on a farm and learned to work before she had learned to read, and which she did not miss exactly but sometimes dreamed about. He told her about Colorado, about the high country that he still carried in his chest like a low note on an instrument, present in everything but not always audible. He told her about learning surveying from a man named Carlisle in Denver, who had been the most demanding teacher he had ever encountered and also the most generous. He told her about 7 years of moving from one contract to the next across the Southwest, and how that life had suited him because he was good at it, and because it kept him moving, and because moving kept him from thinking too carefully about the things he did not have. She listened to him the way she did everything, directly, with full attention, without offering easy reassurances. She just listened, and that was better. The evenings lengthened as May moved toward June. They sat on the porch after dinner sometimes, watching the desert go purple and then dark, listening to the nighthawks call out over the mesquite. Helen's nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile away. The quiet was very large and very soft, and they sat in it together with a growing ease that neither of them named. He noticed everything about her, without meaning to. The way she put her finger in a book to hold her place rather than setting it down. The way she always checked the barn latch twice before bed. The way she talked to her horses with a matter-of-fact affection, as though they were colleagues. The way she laughed rarely, but when she did it was sudden and unguarded, a bright flash of something that she usually kept carefully covered, and it always caught him off guard in the best possible way. She noticed things about him too, though she was less likely to volunteer this information. She noticed that he was thorough in a way that went beyond professionalism, that he did not leave tasks half-finished, and did not make promises he did not intend to keep. She noticed that he repaired the loose board on her porch step one morning without mentioning it, and fixed the hinge on the barn door, and filled the water trough when she was busy with other things. She noticed that he was patient with her, not in the way of a man managing a difficult woman, but in the way of someone who genuinely respected that she had her own pace and her own manner. She did not tell him any of this. But one evening in the middle of May, when they were sitting on the porch and the sunset was extravagant over the mountains, she moved her rocking chair 2 inches closer to his, without appearing to notice that she had done it, and he did not point it out, and that was its own kind of conversation. Boyd Cal and his 2 men came back on a Friday morning in the 3rd week of May. There was a 4th man with them this time, a wiry man in a gray suit who did not look like a cowboy and who carried a document case rather than a rifle. A lawyer, Micah thought, and was proven right when the man introduced himself as Franklin Oakes, representing the legal interests of Warren Anson. Micah was working at the survey table he had set up near the town commission office when Helen came to find him. She walked quickly, but she was not running, and when she told him what was happening, he packed his instruments without rushing and walked back to her property with her at a steady, unhurried pace. They were at the gate when he arrived. Boyd Cal gave Micah a look that had not gotten any warmer in the weeks since their first meeting, but he said nothing. The lawyer stepped forward. "Mr. Hale, is it?" "I'm Franklin Oakes. You are, I understand, the surveyor who filed a boundary dispute on behalf of the Whitaker property last week in Santa Fe." "I am," Micah said. "I need to explain to you that this dispute was filed on a procedural basis that is technically incorrect. The parcel in question is not a boundary dispute. It is a deed precedence dispute, and as such it falls under a different set of territorial regulations that—" "Mr. Oakes," Micah said, "I'm familiar with the distinction. The filing I made was specifically under federal statute, not territorial regulation, because the original patent was issued under the Homestead Act of 1862, which makes it a federal matter. That's why your Mr. Anson can't simply have a territorial marshal show up with an eviction order. He'd need a federal court order, and to get a federal court order he'd have to go through a federal land commissioner." The lawyer blinked. "That is a somewhat creative interpretation. It is the correct interpretation," Micah said pleasantly. "I have a copy of the relevant sections if you'd like to review them." Oakes looked at his document case and then back at Micah. Helen was standing slightly to Micah's right, very still. Boyd Cal's horse shifted in the dirt. "Mr. Anson," Oakes said, switching tactics, "is prepared to offer Mrs. Whitaker an additional sum on top of the recorded sale price. He understands that she has experienced some distress over this misunderstanding, and he wants to resolve the matter amicably." "It is not a misunderstanding," Helen said. "I did not sell this land. I am not selling this land. There is nothing to resolve. Mrs. Whitaker, be reasonable." "I am being extremely reasonable," she said. "I am standing on my own property telling you that it is my property, and I am not shooting at any of you, which I think demonstrates remarkable reasonableness given the circumstances." Despite everything, Micah almost lost his composure. He kept his face straight by concentrated effort. Oakes made a few more attempts, each one met by Helen's steady refusal and Micah's calm legal counterargument, and eventually the lawyer snapped his case shut and informed them that Mr. Anson would pursue this through the appropriate channels. "We expect him to," Micah said. "We look forward to it." They rode away again, and this time Helen's rifle was still leaning against the fence post. She had not needed it. When the dust of their horses had settled, Helen turned to look at Micah. There was something in her expression not exactly soft, because Helen's expressions were rarely soft, but there was something that was open in a way he had not seen before, like a door that had been briefly allowed to stand ajar. "You are difficult to argue with," she said. "Only when I'm right," he said. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she said, "Come have lunch," and she went back through the gate and he followed. Over lunch, cold cornbread and a pot of bean soup and more of the strong coffee, she said something that had clearly been working its way up through her all morning. "Micah." She had started using his first name sometime in the second week without marking the occasion. "I want to say something to you, and I want you to hear it as it is meant." He set down his cup. "This land," she said, looking at the table, then up at him, "is not worth what you are putting into it. What you are putting into this, the trips to Santa Fe, the legal filings, the time, the work. What Anson wants from it is the railroad money, and that money may or may not arrive, and the land itself is—" She paused, looking for the word. "It is dry and hard, and it produces barely enough to live on. I am not a wealthy widow with valuable holdings. I am a woman with 32 acres of New Mexico desert and 60 head of cattle and a house that needs a new roof on one corner." "The roof can wait," he said. "Micah." Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it now, a kind of ache that she was trying to keep out of it. "I am trying to tell you that you do not have to do this. The land is not worth fighting for, not at this cost." He looked at her across the table. The noon light was coming through the kitchen window and falling across her face, and he thought about what she had said, and he thought about the 7 years he had spent moving from place to place across this hard, beautiful territory, surveying other people's land and sleeping in boarding houses, and never once having a reason to stop moving. "Helen," he said, and the way he said her name was different from the way he usually said it, quieter and more certain. "The land is not what I am fighting for." She went still. He let that sit for a moment because he was not a man who added unnecessary words. Then he said, "I know you don't need me to solve your problems. I know you have been managing alone, and I know you are capable of continuing to manage alone. I'm not here because I think you need rescuing." "Then why are you here?" she asked. Her voice had gotten quieter. "Because I have not wanted to leave," he said. "Not since the second day." She looked at him for a long time. The clock on the kitchen shelf counted the seconds, an old brass clock that had come with her from Missouri, one of the few things she had brought that was not purely practical. She looked at him, and he let her look, and he let her think, and he did not fill the silence because he had learned that she needed space to move through things in her own way. "I am still in the middle of a legal battle," she finally said. "I know. I am not easy to live with." "I have noticed that," he said, and there was enough warmth in it that it could not be taken as criticism. "You have been here 5 weeks, and already I argue with you about the coffee. You think I make it too weak. You are not wrong." And there it was, that sudden, bright, unguarded laugh flashing out before she could contain it. It changed her whole face. It made her beautiful in a different way than the storm. It made her beautiful the way that sunlight on water was beautiful, something warm and moving that you wanted to keep watching. She covered the laugh with her hand, which she did sometimes as though surprised by it, but she was smiling when she lowered her hand, a real smile, not a careful one. "You are difficult," she said. "You mentioned that. I meant it affectionately this time." He smiled at her then, a full smile, which was also somewhat rare for him, and said, "I know." They did not say anything more direct than that on that day. But something had shifted in the air between them, something that could not be shifted back, and neither of them wanted it back. In the days that followed, things were the same and entirely different. They still sat at the kitchen table in the evenings. They still went over the documents when there were new developments. They still sat on the porch and watched the stars come out, those enormous New Mexico stars that seemed within arm's reach in the clear desert dark. But now when they sat, their chairs were not 2 inches closer. They were close enough that his shoulder was nearly touching hers, and when they walked the property line together to check the fence posts, his hand found hers once briefly, and she did not pull it away, and the next time it happened she laced her fingers through his. He held her hand like it was something he intended to keep, and she held his back like a woman who had decided to trust the ground she was standing on. Word came from Albert Dowd in the first week of June. The letter was addressed to Micah at the town post office, and he read it on the walk back to Helen's property and then sat down at the kitchen table and read it again. He looked up to find Helen watching him from across the table. "Dowd is coming," he said. "He'll be in Santa Fe by the 20th of June. He has been in contact with the Land Commissioner's office in Washington. He says the Thomas Greer matter is known to them. Apparently this is not the first case Greer has handled irregularly, and that the investigation has already begun." Helen was very still. "He wants the original documentation, that we have the certified copy of the pat, the letters from the land office, and my survey filing. He says that based on what I sent him, he believes the forged deed can be invalidated." She pressed her hands flat on the table. "How certain is he?" "He says believed and expects, not certain, but Dowd is a careful man. He doesn't overstate things." Micah looked at her. "I think this is going to work, Helen." She closed her eyes for just a moment. When she opened them, he saw that they were bright, and he understood that she had been carrying the weight of this fear, the fear of losing the land, the home she had built with Robert, the last thing she had left of that life for 2 years. Through all her careful management and practical efficiency, it had been there underneath everything, this fear. And now someone was telling her, carefully and credibly, that it might be over. "I need to go check on the cattle," she said, standing up. Her voice was perfectly level. "The north fence line needs looking at." "Helen," she stopped. "It is all right," he said, "if you are relieved." She stood there for a moment with her back to him. Then her shoulders moved just slightly, and she turned around and she walked back to the table and she sat down and she put her face in her hands for exactly 30 seconds, he counted, because he did not want to intrude, and then she raised her head and her eyes were bright but no tears had fallen because that was not Helen's way, and she said, "Thank you, Micah." "The credit belongs to the law," he said. "The law had this document for 2 years," she said. "The law did nothing with it. You did." He had no argument for that. He rode to Santa Fe on the 15th of June with the full packet of documents and met Albert Dowd, a spare, gray-haired man with gold-rimmed glasses and the precise manner of someone who had spent 40 years making certain that what was true on paper matched what was true on the ground. They spent 2 days going through the documents together, and Dowd confirmed everything Micah had believed. The deed of sale was fraudulent, the recording was irregular, and Thomas Greer had accepted payment from Warren Anson's holding company in a way that was demonstrably connected to the falsified filing. He also told Micah something else. Warren Anson himself had been called to provide testimony to the Federal Land Office on 3 other properties, and he was in a considerably weaker position than he appeared. His strategy of buying forged documents from corrupt clerks had worked 3 times before, but it required the original claimants to be unaware of federal process, isolated, and without legal support. In Helen's case, none of those conditions had held. Micah rode back to Harrow Creek on the 18th of June with a formal notice of investigation from the Federal Land Commissioner's office, which meant that no eviction order could be issued by any court, state or federal, until the investigation was resolved. He arrived in the late afternoon. Helen was in the kitchen garden when she saw him ride up. She came through the gate and met him at the hitching post, and she was still wearing her garden gloves, and she looked at his face before he had said a word. "It's done," she said. "The investigation is formally opened. Anson cannot touch the property while it proceeds, and based on what Dowd has, it will not proceed in Anson's favor." She stood there for a moment, the June evening warm and clear around her, the mountains going gold in the late light. He was still on horseback, looking down at her, and she looked up at him with those gray eyes that he had been studying for nearly 2 months and had still not fully mapped, and she said, very quietly, "Get down off that horse, Micah." He swung down from Cutter's back. He was barely on the ground when she stepped forward and put her arms around him, not hesitantly, not carefully, but fully, the way she did things when she had decided to do them, and he put his arms around her and held her, and she pressed her face briefly against his chest, and he felt her exhale, this long, slow, months-deep exhale, and then she stepped back. Her eyes were very bright and she was not quite smiling. "I have dinner on," she said. "I thought you might," he said. They went inside. That evening after dinner they sat on the porch and watched the moon rise nearly full, enormous and pale gold above the desert, and somewhere in the long, quiet comfort of it Helen said, "What do you do next, after the survey is finished?" "I had a contract offer from Tucson," he said. "Before I came here." She was quiet. The moon continued to rise. "I wrote back and declined it," he said. Another silence. The nighthawks called. From somewhere across the desert came the distant sound of a coyote and then nothing. "Why?" she asked. She already knew why. She wanted to hear him say it. "Because there is nothing in Tucson that is keeping me," he said. "And there is something here that is." She turned her head and looked at him in the moonlight. He looked back at her, and for once neither of them was being practical or careful or measured. They were just 2 people on a porch in the New Mexico moonlight on the other side of a long fight looking at each other. "I am still difficult," she said. "Helen," he said, "difficult is not the problem. I am still grieving Robert in some ways. I know that, and I will not be managed or handled or told what to do. I have noticed, and I argue about the coffee. The coffee argument is legitimate," he said. "I do make it too weak." There was that laugh again, that sudden, bright, unguarded thing, and when it had passed she was still smiling, and he reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, and she let him, and she wrapped her fingers around his, and they sat like that for a very long time in the warm June dark. He kissed her for the first time 3 days later, on a Sunday morning in the kitchen, while they were arguing about whether biscuits needed bacon fat or butter. An argument of no particular importance that had somehow become very important in the small, warm, flour-dusted space of the kitchen, with Helen defending the virtues of butter and Micah defending bacon fat with equal seriousness. And somewhere in the middle of it, they had stopped arguing and were simply standing very close to each other looking at each other's faces, and he kissed her. It was not tentative. He was not a tentative man when he had made up his mind about something, and he had made up his mind about Helen Whitaker some considerable time ago. And she was not a tentative woman, so she kissed him back with the same directness that she brought to everything, her hands coming up and holding his face, and when they stepped apart they were both slightly breathless, and the biscuits were forgotten entirely. "Butter," she said, after a moment, a little breathlessly. "Bacon fat," he said, and she laughed, and that was the beginning of everything. The summer of 1882 was the best summer of Micah Hale's adult life, and he thought it was probably the best summer Helen had lived through in several years, though he did not say this because he did not want to speak for her. He completed his town survey and was offered an additional contract by the commission to survey the land parcels along the railroad right-of-way, which kept him in Harrow Creek through August. He worked from the barn office and from a desk the town commission set up for him in their building, and he came home. He had started thinking of it as home, and he noted this without surprise, because it felt inevitable in the evenings, and ate dinner with Helen and walked with her in the long summer evenings and held her hand and argued about coffee and books and the best way to repair a fence post, and all of it was the best thing he had ever had. She taught him things. She taught him how to read the desert's weather, the particular angle of certain cloud formations that meant rain within the hour, the way the creosote bushes smelled before a storm. She taught him which plants in the high desert were medicinal and which were not, information she had gathered from 2 years of solitary study, and from conversations with the Pueblo people at the reservation at the edge of the valley, with whom she had established a careful, respectful acquaintance. She taught him how to mend a bridle the correct way, which he had been doing slightly wrong for years without knowing it. He taught her the full complexity of federal land law, which she absorbed with characteristic speed and precision, so that by August she understood it better than most men he knew who worked in the field. He taught her the mathematics of surveying, the geometric proofs underlying it, which delighted her because she had a mathematical mind that no one had ever given proper material to work with. He read to her in the evenings sometimes, from the novels on her shelf, taking turns with pages, and he discovered that she had the most extraordinary voice for reading, clear and expressive, able to shift between characters without effort, and she laughed at the right moments and went quiet at the right moments. He found over these months that she was not difficult in the way that word usually meant. She was clear. She said what she meant. She did not play games with her feelings or use silences as weapons or expect him to guess at things she had not said. When something bothered her, she said so. When she was happy, the quality of the air around her changed in a way he had learned to read. When she was uncertain, she named it. It was the most honest relationship he had ever been in, and it was, he realized, exactly what he had always wanted without ever having been able to articulate it. In August, the formal finding came from Albert Dowd's office. The Federal Land Commissioner's investigation had concluded that the deed of sale in Warren Anson's holding company's name was fraudulent, that the recording was void, and that the original land patent held by the estate of Robert Whitaker, currently administered by Helen Whitaker, was valid and clear. Thomas Greer had been removed from his position and referred for criminal prosecution. Warren Anson had been assessed significant financial penalties and was now the subject of 3 other federal investigations on related matters. Helen read the letter at the kitchen table while Micah watched her face. She read it all the way through, turned it over, and set it down. She smoothed the paper once with her fingertips, the way she sometimes smoothed the pages of a book she had just finished. "It's over," she said. "It's over," he confirmed. She looked up. "He won't come back. He will not come back. He is facing federal proceedings on 4 properties. He is not in a position to wage further battles." She nodded. She was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at him directly, fully, those gray eyes that he had learned to read in the way he read survey markers, knowing that they always pointed to the truth. "Micah." "Yes." "Will you stay?" He understood what she was asking. Not will you stay for another week or another contract. Will you stay? Will this be where you stop moving? "Yes," he said. "If you want me to." "I want you to," she said very simply, and that was the whole of it. He stayed. They married in October of 1882 in the yard of the property because Helen said she did not care for churches particularly and the yard was more honest. They had fought for it after all, and it seemed right to be married on it. The ceremony was performed by the Harrow Creek Justice of the Peace, a solemn, friendly man named Judge Paul Ardmore, who had known Robert and who looked at Helen with a kind of quiet approval as he watched her stand in the autumn light next to Micah Hale, with her chin up and her eyes clear, and her whole self composed and certain. Mrs. Clara Beaumont baked the cake and cried steadily throughout the ceremony, which she said she had the right to do, because she had seen how Micah looked at Helen from the very first week at the boarding house, and she had known. Helen's nearest neighbor, a cattle rancher named Frank Estrada, who had ridden over more than once that spring to offer what help he could against Anson, came with his wife Maria and their 4 children. 2 men from the town commission came. The man who ran the feed store came, which surprised Helen, and she asked him why. And he said because the whole town had known what Anson was doing to her, and no one had done anything about it, and he figured the least he could do was show up for the good part. There was no great ceremony. They stood in the yellow October light with the mountains blue in the distance, and the desert going rust and gold in its autumn colors, and they promised each other things that they both knew they would keep, because they were not people who made promises they did not intend to keep. When Judge Ardmore pronounced them married and told Micah he could kiss his bride, Helen forestalled any dramatic moment by saying to Micah in a voice that only he could hear, "Do not make it theatrical." And he laughed fully, genuinely, a laugh that rose out of him like something that had been stored for years waiting for the right occasion, and he kissed her. And it was not theatrical, but it was also not brief. And when they stepped apart she was smiling in that unguarded way, the one she couldn't contain. Mrs. Beaumont's crying intensified considerably. Frank Estrada clapped Micah on the shoulder and said in Spanish, then in English, that this was a good thing, and Maria pressed a jar of her preserved green chilies into Helen's hands and said that a bride needed green chilies, which Helen agreed with completely. They ate the cake under the cottonwood tree at the edge of the yard, and the afternoon was warm and clear, in the way that New Mexico October afternoons could be, and Micah stood beside his wife with her hand in his, and thought that of all the land he had surveyed in 7 years, all the ranges and parcels and plat maps he had drawn, this was the one he had been making his way toward without knowing it. 32 acres of New Mexico desert that didn't look like much, with a house that needed a new roof on one corner and a barn that needed paint, and a woman who argued about coffee and read legal texts for pleasure and laughed like a sudden light when she forgot to hold it back. It was exactly enough. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was cold but not brutal, the kind of winter the territory offered some years as a kind of gift. The cattle came through it well. The herd slightly expanded from a purchase Micah had made in the fall with part of his survey earnings, 20 head of good stock that Frank Estrada had recommended and helped him select. Helen managed the accounts with the same precision she managed everything, and by spring they had a clearer financial picture than she had had in 2 years, the first time since Robert's death that the property was not simply surviving, but actually building towards something. Micah took additional survey contracts through the winter's shorter jobs, ones that kept him within 2 or 3 days' ride of home. He did not want to be gone long. He had spent 7 years being gone, and he found that he did not miss it at all. Home was a specific and sufficient thing now. It had a particular smell, coffee and cedar smoke, and the faint sage that came in on the desert wind, and a particular sound, which was Helen's voice reading aloud in the evening, and he oriented himself by these things in the way he had always oriented himself by landmarks, the way a surveyor always came back to the datum point from which every measurement begins. In the spring of 1883, Helen told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen, over breakfast, in the same direct way she told all things, watching his face carefully for his reaction. He set down his coffee cup and looked at her, and then he stood up and went around the table and took her hands in both of his and held them. "Are you well?" he asked first, because that was what mattered first. "Very well," she said. "I have spoken to the doctor in town. Everything appears to be proceeding normally." "Good," he said. Then he said, "Helen, I am," and he stopped, because he was not a man who usually had to stop in the middle of a sentence for lack of words, and she saw this, and it clearly moved her because her eyes went bright. "Happy," she offered. "That word is not large enough," he said. She turned her hands in his and held them back. "I am frightened," she said honestly. "And glad, both at once." "Both at once is all right," he said. They stayed like that for a moment in the morning kitchen, holding hands over the breakfast table, and then she said, "Your coffee is getting cold," and he said, "You make it stronger now," and she laughed. He was a very good father from the first hour. This was not something Helen had expected to discover. She had understood he would be conscientious, as he was conscientious about everything. But what she had not anticipated was the depth of tenderness he had for the child. Their son was born in November of 1883, a solid, determined boy they named James Robert Hale, James for Micah's father and Robert for Helen's first husband. And this was Helen's idea, and when she suggested it, Micah's expression did something complicated and grateful that she did not try to analyze, just accepted. James was, from the start, his own particular person. He had Micah's coloring, the dark hair and the angular face, and Helen's eyes, those clear gray eyes that saw things directly, and he had a temperament that was some combination of both of them, which meant he was stubborn and thorough, and had very firm opinions about things that in a 2-year-old were expressed primarily through volume. Micah spent the mornings with James when Helen needed her hands free for the cattle work, carrying the boy on his back in the kind of carrier arrangement he had worked out with a length of canvas and a good deal of ingenuity, and James regarded the world from this vantage point with the solemn, interested expression of a naturalist conducting field work. Micah narrated things to him, the names of plants, the principles of surveying, the qualities of the different mountain ranges visible from the property, and James listened with what appeared to be genuine attention, which Micah found unreasonably satisfying. Helen watched her husband with her son and felt something that she could not have named before she had it, a kind of fullness that was not simple happiness but something more complex and more durable, the feeling of a life that had been built carefully and honestly from good materials that would hold. She also felt, sometimes, a complicated gratitude toward the memory of Robert, that he had brought her to this land, that he had built the first frame of what was now her life. She kept his surveying maps on the shelf beside Micah's. She spoke of him to James as he grew, as someone to be remembered with respect. And Micah, who was a man without small jealousies, honored this without effort, because he understood that love was not a finite resource, and that honoring what had come before did not diminish what was present. The railroad came through the valley in the spring of 1885, exactly as Warren Anson had anticipated, which gave Micah a moment of dry amusement. The man had been right about the value, just wrong in every other particular. The rail line ran along the eastern edge of the territory, half a mile from the property line, and the land values in the valley did indeed increase significantly. Suddenly 32 acres of New Mexico desert was worth a considerably greater sum than it had been 3 years ago. They did not sell. Neither of them had any interest in selling. The railroad brought other things instead: a reliable mail route, better supply access, and a slight expansion of Harrow Creek itself, which acquired a new dry goods store and a small hotel that Mrs. Beaumont viewed with proprietary suspicion before determining it was not a threat to her boarding house clientele. Micah's surveying business expanded with the railroad because railroads required enormous quantities of survey work, and he was hired by the Santa Fe Railway Company as a consulting surveyor for the territorial line planning. He could do much of this work from Harrow Creek, with periodic trips to Santa Fe that rarely exceeded 2 weeks. It was steady, well-compensated work that he was good at, and it meant that the property's finances moved from comfortable to genuinely secure for the first time. He hired 2 ranch hands, good men, a younger brother of Frank Estrada's named Louis, who was 19 and eager to learn, and an older man named Samuel who had worked cattle all his life and treated the herd with the same patient expertise that Micah had always treated a survey line. With their help, Helen expanded the herd significantly, and the cattle operation that had barely sustained her through the hard early years became, by 1886, a properly viable enterprise. She also began to take on a different kind of work, informal at first, and then more formally. People came to her about land questions. Neighbors with boundary disputes, homesteaders uncertain of their rights under the various federal acts, women, especially widows, or wives of men who were not paying attention, who had questions about the status of their property claims. Helen answered their questions with careful, precise information and helped them write the correct letters to the correct offices, and she charged nothing for this, and word of it spread in the quiet way that useful information spreads in small communities. Judge Ardmore asked her once if she had ever considered reading for the law. She said the law was not particularly interested in women reading for it, which was an injustice, she said plainly, and without bitterness. Ardmore agreed it was an injustice. He began sending her his legal texts when he had finished with them, and she read them all, and they had long conversations in his office that functioned, in a practical sense, as something like what she was owed and was not permitted to have formally. It was not enough, but it was what was available, and she made use of it completely. Micah was proud of her in a way that was not possessive. He was proud of her the way he was proud of a piece of survey work that came out exact, the satisfaction of a true thing being fully itself. He told her so, in the direct way she had taught him to say things, and she received it in the direct way she received all things. She was not a woman who deflected compliments, any more than she deflected difficulties. She took them at face value and carried on. In the summer of 1886, Helen told him she was expecting again. This time she told him in the barn, while they were both doing the evening feed. She had simply looked over the stall door at him with that measuring gray look and said, "It appears James is going to have company." And Micah had looked up from the water bucket and smiled at her with that full, unhurried smile that still, after 4 years, made something in her chest do what she had once privately described to herself as becoming briefly disorganized. Their second child, a daughter they named Clara after Mrs. Beaumont, who had told them firmly when James was born that she expected to be acknowledged in the naming of future children, and they had agreed because they were fond of her, arrived in February of 1887. She came into the world with a strong opinion about it, expressed loudly and continuously, and Micah held her in the first hour and looked at Helen over the baby's head with an expression that Helen had learned to read completely, the expression that meant he was so full of something that the only way he could contain it was to be very still. "She has your eyes," he said. "She has your lungs," said Helen, who was tired and very content. James, who was 3 and deeply interested in the logistics of having a sister, stood on his tiptoes at the edge of the bed, and studied the infant with the solemn, naturalist expression that Micah had always found familiar, and announced that she was smaller than he had expected, and that he would teach her about mountains, which was generous and somewhat bewildering, and which both Micah and Helen found extremely correct. Mrs. Beaumont, when she came to see the baby the following day, did in fact cry again, and said that being the namesake of this particular child was the greatest honor of her life, and Helen told her that was an excessive claim but that she appreciated it anyway, and Mrs. Beaumont said this was exactly why she loved Helen, and that was how that went. The years moved with the quality that good years have fully, and without the sense of time being wasted. James grew into a boy who was both his parents clearly, which meant he asked rigorous questions about everything and then argued with the answers, and Micah found teaching him the surveying principles he had loved since youth to be one of the great pleasures of his life. By the time James was 6, he could read a compass bearing. By 8, he had his own field notebook. Clara grew into someone entirely her own, less like either parent in temperament than like some third thing they had not anticipated. She was quick and social and laughed easily, which she had not inherited from Helen, and she had a quality of attention for people, a genuine interest in whatever a person was feeling or thinking, that made everyone around her feel, when she was speaking to them, that they were the most interesting person she had encountered. This was both a gift, and Micah noted, possibly something to keep an eye on. Helen noticed that Micah was never less than fully present with their children, that when he was with them, not thinking about the survey contract or the cattle prices or anything else. She thought this was the best thing she knew about him, and she told him so, which made him quiet for a moment in the way he went quiet when she said things that went straight to the center. In the fall of 1888, they repaired the roof on the house, the corner that had needed it since before Micah arrived, and while they were at it, they built on a second room at the back, because James and Clara sharing a room was becoming a source of daily diplomatic tension that even the most skilled negotiators in the family, which was Helen, could only partially contain. They built it together, Micah and Louis and Samuel doing the framing and roofing, Helen and Maria Estrada doing the interior finish, and it took 3 weeks and required the resolution of several strongly held differences of opinion about window placement that were negotiated over the kitchen table in the evenings with the same seriousness that Helen had once applied to federal land law. The room turned out well. James moved into it immediately and declared it satisfactory, which for James was high praise. One evening in October of 1888, when the children were asleep and the autumn dark had settled over the desert, and the stars were very large and close in the clear New Mexico air, Micah and Helen sat on the porch as they had been sitting on porches together for 6 years, and she leaned her head against his shoulder as she had started doing sometime in the 2nd year, and he rested his cheek against her hair as he always did. "Do you remember," she said, "what I told you in the kitchen that afternoon, when you had come back from Santa Fe with the documents?" "I remember everything," he said. "I told you the land was not worth fighting for," she said. "I meant it to be kind. I did not want you to spend yourself on something that might come to nothing. I know why you said it." "I was wrong," she said. "Not about the land exactly. You were right that it was not the land, but I was wrong about what something is worth fighting for. I thought I knew, I thought I had learned it from losing Robert from the years alone. I thought I knew the limits of what was worth the cost." He lifted his head. She lifted hers. They looked at each other in the October dark, and she was smiling, that soft smile that was different from the unguarded laugh. This one was chosen, something she offered deliberately. "You changed my mind," she said. "You changed mine first," he said. "Before you knew you were doing it." She considered him. "How?" "The first morning," he said, "standing in the street, 3 men on horses and a rifle and not a single step back. I thought," he paused, finding the word, "I thought, here is someone who knows exactly what she is standing on." She turned this over. "I was frightened," she said. "That morning I was more frightened than I have ever been." "I know," he said. "That was the other part. You were frightened and you stood there anyway." She was quiet. The night was very soft around them. Somewhere out in the desert a coyote sang, a long rising note, and then was quiet. "Micah," she said. "Helen, I love you." She said it the way she said all things, directly, without embellishment, with her full attention behind it. She had said it many times now, but she said it each time as though she meant it specifically for this moment, not as a habit but as a present tense fact. "I love you," he said back, in the same way, with the same specific weight. They sat together in the dark as the stars wheeled slowly overhead. The same stars, Micah sometimes thought, that he had been sleeping under for 7 years while he moved from one place to another across the territory. Looking at those stars with a feeling he had not had a name for but which had been, he now understood, the feeling of a man who does not yet know where his home is. He knew where it was now. He knew it with the precision of a man who has made a life's work of knowing where things are. It was here. It was this, it was her. The spring of 1889 brought news from Washington that was felt throughout the territory. The omnibus bill that would eventually bring statehood to New Mexico was being discussed, and the Federal Land Commissioner's office was undertaking a comprehensive review of all land patents in the territorial jurisdiction to ensure clean title before any statehood proceedings began. This meant Micah had more work than he could easily manage alone, and he brought on a young surveying apprentice, a serious young man named Henry Cross from Albuquerque, who had good instincts and was willing to learn, and who was deeply respectful of Helen's opinion on legal matters in a way that made her assess him favorably from the start. Henry worked from the barn office that Micah had once occupied, and was fed at the kitchen table on weekday evenings, and gradually became a kind of fixture of the household, treated by James and Clara with the cheerful familiarity of children who have decided a person is acceptable. Through the spring and summer, Micah supervised the review of land patents across a 3-county area, including the final and complete reaffirmation of the Whitaker land patent, now formally recorded as Hale family property, clear title, no encumbrances, filed and recorded at both the territorial and federal level in triplicate, witnessed by Albert Dowd himself when the commissioner's inspector made his scheduled visit that June. Dowd shook Micah's hand at the end of the filing and said that this particular case had been one of the more satisfying resolutions he had seen in his career, which, given that Dowd had a career spanning 41 years in several territories, Micah took as meaningful. Helen, standing beside Micah, shook Dowd's hand and thanked him with the specific, calibrated precision with which she thanked people, not effusively, not briefly, but with an accuracy that communicated exactly what his contribution had meant. Dowd, who was not accustomed to being thanked with such clarity, seemed genuinely moved by it. "You have a remarkable wife, Mr. Hale," Dowd said. "I do," Micah said, without any false modesty. Helen, who was not modest either, said, "He is also not too bad," and Micah laughed, and Dowd, somewhat surprised by this domestic dynamic, looked between them with the expression of a man who has witnessed something slightly beyond his previous experience and has decided it is very good. By the fall of 1889, the life they had built was so fully itself that Micah sometimes paused at the survey table, or on the porch in the evening, or at the kitchen table over breakfast, just to take stock of it, the way a surveyor occasionally steps back from the detail work to view the whole map. What he saw when he did this was not perfect in the way that photographs were perfect, static, and without weight. It was something more real than that, with its difficulties and its repairs and its arguments about coffee and its complicated grief still carried gently for a man named Robert, and its board-by-board construction that he could trace the history of if he looked carefully. He looked carefully. He always had. James was 5 now and already obsessed with the idea of becoming a surveyor himself, though he changed his mind approximately once a week about what kind, sometimes a railroad surveyor, sometimes a boundary surveyor, Sometimes, after a conversation with Helen about the federal land system, a government surveyor working on patent review. Helen pointed out that all of these were surveying and that he had time to decide which specific variety, and James received this with the solemn consideration it deserved. Clara at 2 was discovering the particular power that extremely cheerful people have over the world, the discovery that if you are delighted by things, people are delighted by your delight and will provide more things for you to be delighted by. She was applying this discovery with great systematization. Micah watched this process with an admiration that was only slightly complicated by parental concern. Helen continued her work with neighbors and their land questions. In 1889, she helped a widow named Berta Salazar resolve a boundary dispute with a neighboring rancher that had been running for 3 years. By identifying a surveying error in the original plat and filing the correct amendment through Micah's professional license. The resolution of this case gave Helen a satisfaction that she said was second only to the resolution of her own case, because it was more abstract and also, she said, because it demonstrated that what she had learned could be applied beyond her own situation, which mattered to her. Micah told her she should be charging for these services. She said she was aware of that, and she was not going to. He said she was going to spend herself out if she wasn't careful. She said she appreciated his concern and would take it under advisement. He said that was a complete non-answer. She said yes, and poured him more coffee, stronger than she used to make it, because she had conceded this point in the 2nd year of their marriage. He drank the coffee and accepted the non-answer because he had also learned in 6 years when an argument was concluded. In October of 1889, they walked the full perimeter of the property together on a Sunday afternoon, as they did sometimes on Sundays when the weather was good. It took about an hour. James came with them, carrying the small compass Micah had given him, marking the corners seriously in his field notebook. Clara rode on Micah's shoulders with her hands braced on his head and narrated the landscape with cheerful commentary that bore only a partial relationship to the landscape as it actually was. They walked the fence lines that Micah had first ridden in that spring morning 7 years ago. They walked the north line that had been disputed and was no longer disputed. They walked the south line along the dry creek bed that ran with water in the wet season and was mostly rock in the dry one. They walked the east line where the scrubby desert stretched away toward the railroad tracks, and the west line where the land ran up against the first long slope of the mountains. When they had completed the circuit and come back to the gate, the same gate where Micah had tied Cutter on the first morning, they stopped and looked at the property from the outside for a moment, which was not something they often did. The house had a new roof. The barn had a coat of paint, finally, a deep red-brown that looked right against the desert landscape. The cottonwood by the fence had grown in 7 years and was now large enough to throw real shade in the afternoons. The kitchen garden was full of the last of the autumn tomatoes. 2 horses stood at the water trough. Smoke rose from the kitchen stovepipe. "Well," James said, reading his compass bearing with great seriousness, "we are 22 degrees off north." "We are standing at the gate, James," Helen said. "North is that way," she pointed. "I know where north is," James said with dignity. "I was accounting for the magnetic variation." Helen looked at Micah. Micah pressed his lips together. Clara, from her position on his shoulders, made a noise of general agreement with the concept of magnetic variation. Helen looked back at her home and felt the full specific weight of what it was. The land beneath her feet dry and hard and holding on, the way things in this desert held on, the way she had held on, the way good things hold on when they are worth holding on to. She reached out and took Micah's hand. He looked down at her. His eyes were warm and unhurried, the way they had been from the beginning, that quality of looking that gave her room, that never pressed or crowded, that let her be exactly what she was without requiring her to be anything else. "Ready?" he said. "Ready," she said. They went back through the gate, and James raced ahead to the barn to check on the horses, and Clara demanded to be put down now and ran after her brother, and Helen and Micah walked back across the yard of their home in the warm October afternoon, hand in hand. This was what he had fought for. Not the land, he had told her truly, on that long-ago afternoon in the kitchen, that it was not the land. The land was 32 acres of high desert that didn't look like much and looked like everything, depending on how you stood on it. He had fought for this, for her, for the life she was making, for the right of something real and worth keeping to survive the people who tried to take it. He had stood on a piece of ground and decided to stay, and she had stood on the same ground and decided to let him. And from those two decisions made by two careful, stubborn, honest people who had been shaped by loss and rebuilt themselves into something durable, all of this had grown. 32 acres, a house with a new roof, a barn with red paint, 2 children, a barn office that still had pencil marks from a good man's survey work, and now from 2 other sets of hands. A kitchen table where they had argued and worked and eaten and talked and planned. A porch where they had watched the stars and held each other's hands in the dark. He had ridden into Harrow Creek in the spring of 1882 not looking for anything in particular, and had found everything. The years that followed, and there were many of them, good ones, full and imperfect, and built out of the daily work of being 2 people who had chosen each other, settled into the life of the property, the way water settles into good ground. James grew into a young man with his father's precision and his mother's stubbornness and became, as he had always intended, a surveyor, working with Micah through his teenage years, and eventually striking out on his own with a survey contract in the northern part of the territory. Though he came back on holidays with news and opinions, and argued with both his parents about politics and land law with a lively confidence that Helen found very satisfying and Micah found completely familiar. Clara became a schoolteacher, which suited her perfectly. She taught at the Harrow Creek School from the age of 18, and brought to it the same quality of genuine attention for people that she had been demonstrating since she was 2, and her students found her both rigorous and kind, which is the best combination for a teacher to be. She came home for Sunday dinners and filled the kitchen with her easy laughter and argued with James when he visited and discussed books with her mother, and helped her father with the survey ledgers in the evenings, because she had inherited the mathematical instinct and liked to use it. Micah and Helen grew into their later years the way they had built everything steadily, with attention, without drama. There was a specific quality to the life they had made that had to do with the fact that they had both known, before each other, what it was to lose something you believed was permanent, and this knowledge made them careful with what they had in a way that was not fearful but was thorough. He still made the coffee weak. She still told him so. He still deferred to her analysis on legal questions, because she was still better at it than almost anyone he knew. She still walked the fence line on Sunday mornings when the weather was good, and he still went with her. On a Sunday morning in the spring of their 22nd year on the property, they walked the full perimeter again, just the 2 of them, James and Clara long since grown and on their own paths, Louis Estrada now managing the cattle operation with the same steady expertise he had learned at their table, Samuel, retired to a small house in town that they had helped him settle into with genuine fondness. The 2 of them walked the same fence lines they had walked 100 times, in all the weathers the New Mexico territory could produce, and came back to the gate at the south end of the property. The cottonwood by the fence was very large now. It threw deep shade across half the yard in the afternoon. The house had been repaired and added to several times over the years and was comfortable in the way of homes that have been lived in fully. The barn was still red. The mountains were still there, blue and enormous against the sky. They stood at the gate and Micah looked at her. She was 50 now, and the gray in her hair matched her eyes, and the years were in her face the way years were in good wood, not as damage, but as proof of what it had been through and was still standing after. She was the same in the ways that mattered. The direct gaze, the set of her shoulders, the quality of attention she gave to everything she looked at, including him, including this land, including this life. She looked back at him and saw what she always saw, the man who had ridden in on a gray gelding one spring morning and stood between her and what threatened her. Not because he had to, not because anyone had asked him to, not because the land was worth it, but because she was standing on it, and that had been enough of a reason for him from the very first moment, to plant his feet on the same ground and stay. She took his hand. His fingers closed around hers the way they always had, with the same intention, the same certainty. "Ready?" she said. "Always," he said, and they went home.